One of the strangest movie locations in modern Hollywood history was never supposed to become a film set. It was supposed to become the future. It was supposed to become the airport that would carry Montreal into a new era, dominate air travel in eastern Canada, and prove that one city's ambition was simply too big to fail. Instead, it became one of the most famous infrastructure disasters in North America. And years later, when Steven Spielberg needed a giant airport setting for the terminal, this failed dream suddenly became useful in a way nobody had planned. That alone should tell you how weird this story is. Because this is not just a story about a bad airport. It is a story about ego. About forecasts. About political ambition. About a city that believed momentum would last forever. And about what happens when leaders stop building for real people and start building for history. That is what Mirabel really was. Not just an airport. A monument to confidence. A concrete bet on a future that never arrived. And the strangest part is that when this project began, it did not feel crazy at all. It actually felt obvious. That is how big failures usually start. Not with obvious stupidity. But with success. Montreal in the middle of the 20th century was not some sleepy city trying to dream above its weight. It was already one of the most important cities in Canada. It had money. It had culture. It had business. It had elegance. It had international energy. And more importantly, it had something every ambitious city desperately wants: momentum. But Montreal also had something else. A deep identity wound. Because long before the airport story began, the city had already spent generations caught in a very specific kind of tension. French roots. British power. Catholic tradition. Modern pressure. Local pride. National uncertainty. It was the kind of place that could look sophisticated from a distance and deeply unsettled up close. And if you want to understand why its leaders became so obsessed with giant symbols, you first have to understand why Montreal always seemed to be arguing with itself. The roots of that tension go back centuries. French explorers reached the region in the 1500s. French settlement followed. Then Britain took control. And with that shift, an entire population found itself in a strange historical position. French-speaking people remained rooted in the land, in the culture, in everyday life, but the broader political and economic balance around them kept changing. That kind of pressure does not disappear. It just changes shape. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, Montreal had become a major urban center. But the city never felt simple. It was not just French. Not just British. Not just North American. Not just European in style. It was an argument wearing a suit. It was a city full of pride and insecurity at the same time. And that combination is powerful. Because pride gives a city ambition. Insecurity makes it desperate to prove itself. That is a dangerous mix. Especially when politics gets involved. And politics in Montreal was messy. Very messy. Corruption was a recurring issue. Patronage was everywhere. Backroom influence shaped public life. The Catholic Church held enormous power in Quebec society for a long time, especially over education, healthcare, and social norms. For many people, that religious influence was not just spiritual. It was structural. It was political. It was cultural gravity. And over time, that gravity began to feel heavy. Too heavy. By the 1940s and 1950s, a growing number of younger Quebecers were looking around and asking a difficult question: why does it feel like the modern world is moving faster than we are? That question matters. Because that question changed everything. It helped fuel the Quiet Revolution, a major transformation in Quebec society that weakened old church dominance, expanded the role of the state, modernized institutions, and created a new political mood. It was not a loud military revolution. It was something more unsettling for the old order, a steady transfer of confidence away from tradition and toward reform. And in that atmosphere, a certain kind of public figure suddenly became very powerful. Not the quiet manager. Not the cautious administrator. But the builder. The reformer. The man who could stand in front of a frustrated city and say, "You do not have to stay like this." That is where Jean Drapeau enters the story. Jean Drapeau was not important because he was perfect. He was important because he understood theater. Not fake theater. Political theater. The kind that turns public frustration into public belief. He knew that people do not fall in love with procedure. They fall in love with direction. They want someone who sounds like he knows where the city should go next. And Drapeau sounded like that man. He first built his image through anti-corruption efforts. That gave him credibility. It made him look clean. Serious. Necessary. Like someone willing to walk into the city's ugliest rooms and say, "This cannot continue." That kind of image matters in a place where people have grown tired of excuses. And once he gained power, Drapeau did not behave like a caretaker. He behaved like a man who thought cities could be remade through force of will. That belief became his gift. And eventually, his weakness. Because Drapeau did not just want Montreal to function. He wanted Montreal to matter. He wanted monuments. He wanted systems. He wanted transformation you could see. Subways. Roads. Massive public projects. International events. Visible proof that Montreal was not a second-tier city trying to survive in somebody else's shadow. He believed a city could announce its future through construction. And to be fair, for a while, it looked like he was right. That is what makes the Mirabel story so powerful. It did not begin with failure. It began with success. Montreal in the 1960s looked alive. The city's image was rising. Its infrastructure was improving. Its leaders were bold. Its confidence felt contagious. And then came Expo 67. That matters more than people realize. Because Expo 67 did not just boost tourism. It boosted self-belief. It told Montreal's political class that this city could stand on the world stage and look impressive doing it. That kind of success changes the way leaders think. After a while, ordinary progress no longer feels exciting. Once you have built something that attracts the world, your appetite changes. A functional project is not enough. A smart project is not enough. Now you want a legendary project. Now you want the kind of thing people remember decades later. And that is exactly the emotional environment in which the airport dream began to grow. At the time, air travel seemed like the future. Passenger traffic was increasing. The post-war world was becoming more mobile. Flying had prestige. International gateways had prestige. And Montreal already had Dorval Airport. Dorval was important. Busy. Growing. Useful. But growth creates pressure. More passengers. More noise. More complaints. More forecasts. And once those forecasts started arriving, the conversation changed. Instead of asking how to improve what existed, officials began asking something far more dangerous. What if Montreal needed something much bigger? That was the turning point. Because something much bigger is the exact kind of phrase that seduces ambitious governments. It sounds practical. It sounds forward-looking. It sounds responsible. But inside that phrase is a trap. Because once leaders start thinking in terms of the future, they can talk themselves into almost anything. A bigger airport becomes a giant airport. A giant airport becomes a global airport. A global airport becomes a national prestige project. And a national prestige project becomes an ego competition disguised as planning. That is what happened here. At first, the logic sounded reasonable. Dorval was close to developed areas. Expansion options looked limited. Long-term passenger growth looked strong. Montreal wanted to remain a major international gateway. All true. All understandable. But then the forecasts got bigger. And then the dreams got bigger. And then the political appetites got bigger. Very quickly, this was no longer just about solving a transportation issue. It was about proving something. Proving that Montreal belonged at the center of the future. Proving that Canada could think big. Proving that planners could outrun geography. And proving that Jean Drapeau's era of giant city-making had not peaked yet. That is the important part. Mirabel was not born from fear. It was born from confidence. Too much confidence. The kind of confidence that makes every graph look permanent. Every trend look unstoppable. Every success look self-repeating. That kind of confidence can be intoxicating. It can also be fatal. Because when leaders feel history moving in their direction, they stop asking the questions that matter most. What if these projections are wrong? What if human behavior changes? What if technology changes? What if passengers hate this? What if the thing that looks magnificent on paper feels ridiculous in real life? Those are the boring questions. But boring questions save countries from expensive humiliation. Mirabel was built in an atmosphere where boring questions had almost no glamour. Big questions had glamour. Bigger visions had glamour. And Jean Drapeau was exactly the kind of politician who thrived in that atmosphere. He was not alone, of course. Federal officials were involved. Planners were involved. Other political actors were involved. But Drapeau's larger political style fit the airport dream perfectly. He had already built a public identity around a very simple emotional message: Montreal must not think small. That message worked. People believed him because they had already seen the city change under him. And that is what makes momentum so dangerous. Success does not just strengthen power. It weakens caution. Every victory becomes evidence that the next idea will work too. Even if the next idea is much bigger. Even if the next idea rests on fragile assumptions. Even if the next idea requires governments to bet decades of public logic on numbers that might collapse the second the world changes. And the world was about to change. But before anyone saw that coming, Montreal's leaders were already reaching for scale. Real scale. Not just an upgraded airport. Not just a second runway. Not just relief for Dorval. They were moving toward something much grander. A new airport. A massive airport. An airport built not just for need, but for destiny. And once that kind of language enters a project, reality usually gets shoved to the back of the room. Because when politicians start believing they are building the future, compromise begins to feel weak. Restraint begins to feel embarrassing. And ordinary practicality begins to look like cowardice. That is why the Mirabel story is so much bigger than aviation. It is about the psychology of winning. It is about what happens when a city spends so long rising that it forgets gravity still exists. And in Montreal, gravity was about to return in a brutal way. Because once the idea of a giant airport left the realm of theory, all the hidden conflicts came rushing in at once. Land, power, province versus federal government, regional jealousy, urban pride, economic control, and thousands of ordinary people who were about to discover that somebody else's vision of the future was about to land directly on top of their lives. That is where this story stops being impressive. And starts getting dangerous. Because the moment the airport became real, the dream needed something all giant dreams eventually need: land. A lot of it. And the amount they wanted was so extreme that what followed felt less like planning and more like a government trying to redraw the world. That is where everything escalated. And that is where Mirabel stopped being just an idea and started becoming a warning. By the late 1960s, Montreal's airport problem had officially become an opportunity. That is how officials framed it. But that phrase is doing a lot of work. Because when governments call something an opportunity, what they usually mean is this: a large decision is coming, and powerful people already like the version that helps them look ambitious. That was the mood around the new airport. Dorval Airport was busy. Passenger forecasts were rising. Complaints about noise were becoming harder to ignore. And federal planners began thinking far beyond the next 5 or 10 years. That sounds responsible. The problem is that long-range planning can become a fantasy machine if nobody checks its assumptions. And the assumptions here were huge. Not modest growth. Not careful expansion. Huge growth. The kind that makes every chart point upward forever. The kind that makes leaders feel like delay would be irresponsible. The kind that transforms caution into political weakness. Once those forecasts entered the bloodstream of the project, everything got bigger. The rhetoric got bigger. The stakes got bigger. And the emotional meaning of the airport got bigger. This was no longer just about relieving pressure on Dorval. This was about building the gateway of tomorrow. A place massive enough to absorb future traffic, dominate international air movement, and keep Montreal at the center of Eastern Canadian aviation for generations. There was just one problem. Montreal itself was not built to casually host a giant new airport inside its core geography. The city sat on an island. Land was limited. Expansion was difficult. And that meant the new airport would almost certainly have to go outside the city itself. That is where the technical discussion ended. And the political knife fight began. Because airports do not just move planes. They move wealth. Airports create jobs. Roads. Warehouses. Hotels. Restaurants. Real estate value. Industrial development. Logistics chains. Trade flow. A giant airport can quietly reorganize an entire region. So the question of where to build it was never just about where planes could land safely. It was about who would benefit. Who would sacrifice. Who would control the narrative. And who would eventually claim credit. Different sites were proposed. Some were closer. Some were farther. Some were more politically convenient than geographically logical. Some raised fears that the real winner would not even be Montreal. That fear mattered more than people often admit. Because Quebec politics was already full of tension about power, language, identity, and who got to shape the province's future. The last thing many local leaders wanted was to help create a giant asset that might shift economic gravity in the wrong direction. There were concerns about the Western options. Concerns about proximity to other regions. Concerns about whether the airport might indirectly benefit people living outside Montreal more than the city itself. And once those anxieties entered the conversation, site selection became something uglier than planning. It became a struggle for leverage. Nobody wanted to openly admit that. Of course not. Publicly, everyone talked like serious adults. Transportation needs. Regional balance. Modern planning. Long-term capacity. But underneath all that polished language was the much older truth: every big public project creates a fight over who gets the upside and who gets stuck with the consequences. Eventually, the site near Saint-Scholastique, northwest of Montreal, emerged as the choice that would become Mirabel. On paper, it seemed like a compromise. In reality, it was the birth of a giant gamble. And then came the part that should have terrified everybody. The scale. The scale was absurd. This was not a project shaped by modesty. It was shaped by grand vision. The planners were not thinking about the smallest airport that could solve a problem. They were thinking about one of the largest airport complexes in the world. A project built not just for current traffic, but for massive future expansion. Runways. Terminals. Support infrastructure. Surrounding development. A huge zone around the airport itself. The logic was simple and dangerous: if the future is going to be enormous, then the airport should be enormous too. That sentence sounds sensible until you realize it can justify almost anything. Because once you are planning for the future, there is always a reason to take more land, spend more money, and tell people sacrifice is necessary. And sacrifice came fast. The land expropriation around the future airport site was enormous. Farm families were affected. Local communities were thrown into uncertainty. People who had spent their lives on that land suddenly discovered that they were living inside somebody else's national vision. That is one of the most disturbing parts of the whole story. Mirabel failed later. But the moral cost began early. Long before the passenger numbers disappointed. Long before the airlines complained. Long before the public started mocking the project. Regular people were already paying for it. And when governments expropriate land in the name of progress, they usually tell the same story. This is bigger than you. This is for the public good. This is the cost of modernization. This is how the future gets built. That language is powerful because it makes resistance look selfish. But if the promised future never arrives, then what was all that sacrifice actually for? That is the question Mirabel could never escape. The expropriation became one of the deepest wounds in the project's legacy. Because the project did not merely overreach. It overreached on top of real people. That matters. It matters because failed infrastructure is not just a spreadsheet issue. It is a human issue. An emotional issue. A legitimacy issue. If a government takes land, upends lives, and then produces a white elephant, the failure does not stay technical. It becomes historical humiliation. Still, while construction moved forward, public momentum remained strong. Why? Because giant structures have a hypnotic effect on people. If enough concrete appears, if enough equipment arrives, if enough officials stand in front of cameras looking serious, the public starts assuming the strategy behind the project must be solid. After all, surely this many important people could not all be wrong. But that is exactly what makes large failures so dangerous. They borrow authority from size. The bigger the project looks, the more people assume its underlying logic must be powerful too. Mirabel was excellent at looking powerful. Construction advanced. The first phase took shape. The visuals were impressive. Modern. Expansive. Confident. Exactly the sort of thing a rising city wanted to show the world. And this was happening at a moment when Montreal still wanted badly to believe in its own unstoppable ascent. The city had global attention. Its leadership had boldness. Its political imagination had expanded. And Jean Drapeau, once again, stood near the center of a giant civic dream. That is why the airport mattered so much emotionally. It fit the pattern of his era. Build big. Think big. Speak big. Announce the future before anyone else does. And for Drapeau, that style had produced real victories before. That is what made the coming failure so devastating. It did not destroy a weak reputation. It attacked a strong one. Because Mirabel was not supposed to expose incompetence. It was supposed to confirm vision. It was supposed to reinforce Drapeau's image as the man who pulled Montreal into global modernity. And then, like so many ambitious projects, it reached the moment everyone waits for: opening day. In 1975, Mirabel officially opened as Montreal's new international airport. The optics were glorious. A giant new gateway. A major national project. A signal of confidence. Everything looked historic. But here is the problem. Opening day is when politicians celebrate. Real life begins the day after. And real life was brutal. Because Mirabel's weakness was not hidden deep inside some technical manual. Its weakness was right there in the user experience. The airport was far from the city. Very far by the standards that actually matter to travelers. And distance alone was bad enough. But distance was not the fatal mistake. The fatal mistake was the split system. Mirabel handled international traffic. Dorval retained domestic traffic. That meant a large number of passengers connecting through Montreal had to move between two separate airports. Not two terminals. Not two concourses. Two airports. That sounds manageable on a diagram. In real life, it was maddening. Think about how insane that feels from a traveler's perspective. You land internationally. Now you are not just changing gates. You are changing geography. You are losing time. Losing energy. Losing faith in the system. And if the city is trying to compete as a major transit point, that kind of inconvenience is poison. The problem got worse. A strong rail link that might have made Mirabel more tolerable was not in place. That detail matters enormously. Because it reveals the exact gap between ambition and execution that destroyed the whole project. The planners imagined scale. But they did not secure convenience. They imagined prestige. But they did not secure practicality. They imagined the future. But they did not secure the everyday experience of tired passengers trying to get where they needed to go. That is how you know a project has been designed from the top down. Nobody who truly centered ordinary human behavior would have looked at that split airport arrangement and called it elegant. It was elegant only to people who did not have to live inside it. And once travelers started feeling that friction, the giant dream began to crack. Complaints came in. Not because the architecture was ugly. Not because the runways were bad. But because the system felt wrong. And when transportation feels wrong, users punish it immediately. They reroute. They avoid. They complain. They compare. And that comparison matters, because transportation is one of the few parts of life where convenience can kill prestige in a matter of months. No traveler says, yes, but the planning vision is impressive. They say, this is annoying. And annoying is enough to ruin a hub. Jean Drapeau reportedly grasped the seriousness of the problem quickly. That tells you everything. If one of the project's great political champions starts worrying almost immediately, then the flaw was never subtle. He wanted fixes. Faster links. More coordination. Better movement between the airport and the city. Because without that, Mirabel's promise began to feel hollow. But by then, Montreal was already heading into another massive, reputation-defining gamble, the 1976 Olympics. That matters because megaprojects rarely fail alone. They fail in clusters. A political culture that falls in love with scale tends to create multiple risk points at once. And Drapeau's Montreal had become exactly that kind of place. A city that believed giant projects created greatness. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they create debt, pressure, and public fatigue. Mirabel was already showing signs of stress. The Olympics would create more. And once those pressures began overlapping, the room for fixing mistakes got smaller and smaller. Because now this was not just about aviation. It was about public money, public patience, political credibility, and the terrifying possibility that one of the great symbols of Montreal's future had been built on assumptions that would not survive contact with reality. That was the true threat. Not one bad week. Not one rough opening. But the possibility that the airport had been designed for a version of the world that was already disappearing. And the worst part? That possibility was real. Very real. Because just as Mirabel was trying to establish itself, aviation technology and market logic were changing in ways that made some of its original assumptions weaker by the year. Long-range aircraft improved. Direct flights became more viable. Old stopover logic became less central. Passenger behavior shifted. And suddenly the giant airport of tomorrow looked suspiciously like a giant answer to yesterday's problem. That is one of the cruelest forms of failure. Not being undone by sabotage. Not being undone by scandal. But being undone by timing. By building something enormous for a future that arrives in a different shape. And that is exactly what was happening. Mirabel had opened. The ribbon had been cut. The speeches had been made. The concrete was real. The land was gone. The promise had been sold. And yet the deeper question still hung over the whole project like a storm cloud. What if the future it was built for never actually comes? That question would destroy almost everything. Because once the world stopped behaving the way Mirabel's planners expected, the airport's size stopped looking visionary. And started looking terrifying. The death of Mirabel as a passenger dream did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened slowly. That is what made it so painful. A sudden catastrophe gives politicians someone to blame. A long decline gives them a mirror. And Mirabel became exactly that. A mirror reflecting every bad assumption that had been poured into it. The airport was too far. The split airport system was inefficient. The transit connections never fully solved the core experience problem. Passengers did not enjoy the arrangement. Airlines did not love the arrangement. And the idea that Montreal could function smoothly as a giant two-airport transfer system began to look less like bold planning and more like an expensive misunderstanding of how people travel. That alone would have been enough to weaken Mirabel. But the airport faced a much deeper threat. The world that justified it was changing. For years, one of Montreal's strengths in transatlantic travel had been geography. Aircraft needed intermediate logic. Routes worked differently. Long-distance flying had limits. That gave Montreal real strategic value. But once aviation technology improved and longer-range jets became more common, the old logic weakened. Passengers increasingly preferred direct routes. Airlines increasingly preferred efficient routing. And suddenly an airport built for giant future flows looked far less inevitable than it once had. This is where infrastructure stories become almost tragic. Because the people who plan these projects are often not irrational. They are just trapped inside the assumptions of their moment. And if their moment changes, their masterpiece can age overnight. That is what happened to Mirabel. It was built in an era of optimism about traffic growth, hub dominance, and giant future capacity. But the actual future was less obedient than the forecasts promised. It came with different technology, different airline behavior, different market pressures. And that difference was enough to turn scale into dead weight. At the same time, Montreal itself was changing in ways that made everything harder. Quebec nationalism kept rising. Language politics intensified. Some businesses and English-speaking residents drifted away. Toronto kept strengthening. Power was shifting. And when a city is already fighting over identity, it becomes much harder to sustain unified faith in a giant long-term project that is underperforming in plain sight. That is another reason Mirabel is such a fascinating story. It did not fail in a calm environment. It failed in a politically charged one. That made the project feel even heavier. Because now every weakness could be read through bigger anxieties. Was Montreal losing its place? Was the city's golden era ending? Had ambition become arrogance? Had prestige projects distracted leaders from ordinary reality? Those are not just technical questions. Those are emotional questions. Civilizational questions, in a small c sense. Questions a proud city asks when it suspects it may have misjudged itself. And then there was the Olympics. The 1976 Montreal Olympics became infamous for cost overruns and financial damage. That matters here because it hardened the public's suspicion that big visionary projects could also become giant burdens. Mirabel did not exist in isolation. It was increasingly judged as part of a broader era of overreach. This is what happens when a political style wins too much for too long. At first, large projects feel like proof of courage. Later, they start feeling like proof of appetite. And appetite makes people nervous when the bills arrive. Drapeau had once looked like the man dragging Montreal into the future. Now, as the city struggled with the costs of multiple enormous visions, that same style began to feel risky. Maybe too risky. Mirabel was never just hurting from its own flaws. It was also hurting from context. From fatigue. From the public slowly losing its willingness to hear that one more huge project would solve everything. That emotional shift matters more than most statistics. Because once belief disappears, big infrastructure loses its protective shield. Before that point, people tolerate imperfection because they still believe the project means something. After that point, every flaw looks insulting. Every delay looks stupid. Every expense looks personal. Mirabel crossed that line. Passenger volumes never justified the giant aura surrounding it. Expansion dreams faded. Some of the industrial fantasies attached to the airport failed to materialize the way boosters had hoped. And the broader logic of Montreal as a dominant transfer powerhouse weakened further as market conditions changed. At a certain point, the airport stopped looking like a future king and started looking like an expensive warning sign. And yet institutions are rarely brave enough to admit that quickly. That is one of the recurring laws of public failure. The bigger the project, the slower the confession. Because too many careers are tied to the vision. Too many speeches are on record. Too many leaders have invested too much pride. So the system drifts. It delays the reckoning. It keeps operating. Keeps hoping. Keeps insisting things may improve. And every year, the silence around the obvious becomes more embarrassing. Mirabel entered that zone. A place where everybody serious could see the problem, but nobody wanted to be first to say the larger dream had failed. Then came one of the most morally revealing episodes in the entire saga. Years after the expropriations that had cleared vast land for the project, governments had to confront the scale of what had been taken and what had never been justified by reality. Land was eventually returned to former owners in stages after the scale of the project proved unnecessary. That did not erase the earlier displacement. It simply underlined the extent of the original overreach. And that is devastating. Because once land is taken, once families are uprooted, once governments insist the sacrifice is necessary for history, returning part of it later does not feel like redemption. It feels like an admission. An admission that the state asked ordinary people to absorb the cost of elite overconfidence. That is why Mirabel lingers in memory so strongly. Not merely because it was inefficient, but because it had moral mass. It was too big to be just a planning error. It had displaced too much. Promised too much. Imagined too much. And that made its failure feel like a public betrayal, not just a technical correction. By the 1980s, the emotional atmosphere around Montreal had darkened. The city's momentum was weaker. The image of easy civic triumph was gone. Jean Drapeau himself was no longer the unstoppable builder of an earlier decade. He was still a major figure. Still historically important. Still impossible to talk about Montreal without discussing. But the aura had changed. Because aura always changes when grand visions start leaving scars. He eventually left politics. And his legacy became more complicated. Not destroyed. Complicated. That distinction matters. Drapeau was not a joke. He helped reshape Montreal in undeniable ways. But he also embodied a certain kind of dangerous political temptation, the belief that if a city thinks big enough, scale itself becomes wisdom. Mirabel proved that was not true. Scale is not wisdom. Scale is just scale. Without human-centered design, flexible planning, and respect for how behavior actually works, scale becomes a trap. And Mirabel fell straight into it. Eventually, the basic question became unavoidable. Could Montreal really support both Mirabel and Dorval the way planners had imagined? Could Mirabel ever become the passenger giant it was supposed to be? Could the city keep pretending this arrangement was rational? The answer, slowly and painfully, became no. Dorval was more convenient. Closer. More natural for passengers. More realistic. And realism is the thing giant visionary projects hate most, because realism arrives late and never apologizes. International traffic gradually shifted back toward Dorval. Mirabel's position weakened further. And in 2004, Mirabel's passenger service ended. The airport that was once imagined as one of the great future gateways of North America stopped functioning in that role entirely. That should have been the end of the story. And for a normal airport, it would have been. A failed passenger mega-airport closes, becomes a footnote, and survives only as a cautionary example in planning discussions. But Mirabel was too strange for an ordinary ending. Because once it stopped pretending to be the passenger future, it became useful in ways that its original planners never really imagined. Its emptiness became an advantage. Its scale became an advantage. Its available space became an advantage. Its silence became an advantage. That is one of the funniest and darkest twists in the entire story. The very things that made Mirabel bad at being a normal airport made it unexpectedly attractive for other purposes. Film production found it useful. Large-scale shoots found it useful. Aerospace activity found it useful. Training found it useful. Business aviation found it useful. Certain industrial uses found it useful. And that twist is so perfect it almost feels written by a novelist. A place built to move millions of real passengers found new life by no longer centering real passengers at all. In other words, Mirabel began to recover the moment it stopped trying to be what it had been sold as. That is a brutal lesson. But it is a powerful one. Because sometimes failure is not just about collapse. Sometimes failure is about stubborn misidentification. Sometimes the thing dies because it is being forced to play the wrong role. Mirabel was dying as a passenger dream. But as a wide-open industrial and aerospace space, it had advantages. Lots of them. Once those uses expanded, the site stopped feeling like pure dead weight. It began to feel like something else. Not glorious. Not legendary. But salvageable. That is not the same as success. Let's be honest. Mirabel never became the shining gateway its creators imagined. It never vindicated the original dream. It never proved the vision right. What it did instead was something far stranger. It survived the dream. And maybe that is why this story is still remembered. Because most giant public failures are easy to summarize. Too expensive. Too late. Poorly planned. Wrong location. Bad politics. Mirabel includes all of that. But it also contains something more interesting. A city's psychological portrait. This airport was a physical expression of Montreal at a very specific moment in its history. Proud. Restless. Impatient. Modernizing. Competing with its own insecurity. Trying to prove that it belonged not just in Canada's future, but at the center of it. That is why the airport became so oversized in meaning. It was never just about passenger volume. It was about status. And status projects are always the most dangerous, because the minute reality humiliates them, the embarrassment spreads far beyond the project itself. Mirabel embarrassed the forecasting culture that built it. It embarrassed the political confidence that sold it. It embarrassed the assumption that large plans automatically equal serious thinking. And most of all, it embarrassed the idea that ordinary people will quietly adapt to any system designed over their heads. They will not. Passengers punish inconvenience. Markets punish fantasy. Time punishes arrogance. Mirabel learned all three lessons. And then, somehow, it got a strange second life. Which brings us back to the Spielberg irony. When people hear that a failed Canadian airport later became useful for filmmaking, it sounds almost absurd. But it is actually perfect. Because the terminal is a story about being stuck inside an airport. And Mirabel, in a historical sense, was exactly that. A place stuck between promise and reality. Stuck between scale and usefulness. Stuck between political fantasy and human practicality. Stuck between the future it was built for and the reality that showed up instead. That is why the connection feels so fitting. This airport was supposed to represent motion. Instead, history left it suspended. Not fully dead. Not truly victorious. Just stranded in a space between ambition and adaptation. And maybe that is the truest ending possible. Mirabel was not saved by the greatness of its original design. It was saved by the collapse of its original illusion. Once the illusion died, the place could finally become something more honest. That is not a triumphant ending. But it is a real one. And real endings are often stronger than triumphant ones. Because in the end, Mirabel's story is not really about airplanes. It is about what cities believe when they are winning. It is about what governments do when forecasts flatter them. It is about how builders confuse size with inevitability. And it is about the price ordinary people pay when elite confidence turns into public concrete. If you want the cleanest version of the lesson, it is this: the airport failed because it was designed to impress the future instead of serve the present. That one sentence explains almost everything. It explains the distance. It explains the scale. It explains the expropriation. It explains the false certainty. It explains the humiliation. And it explains why the place only became truly useful after the original vision had been stripped away. Because once Mirabel stopped trying to rule North America, it finally became good at being itself. That is the black comedy at the center of the whole story. A project built to announce greatness had to shrink, surrender, and reinvent itself before it could become genuinely valuable. And cities hate that lesson. Politicians hate that lesson even more. Because it means the future is not conquered by ambition alone. It is negotiated, tested, adjusted, corrected, and sometimes saved only after a beautiful idea collapses. Mirabel collapsed as a dream, then survived as a place. That is not what its creators wanted. But it may be the most honest fate it could have had. And maybe that is why people still talk about it. Not because it was the airport of the future, but because it became a monument to one of the oldest mistakes in modern politics, thinking that history rewards the biggest vision, when very often it rewards the vision that actually understands people. That was the mistake. That was the cost. And that was the legacy. The airport that was supposed to rule the future did not end up ruling anything. It became a warning. A set. A leftover giant. A surviving ghost of a city's most overconfident era. And somehow, that ended up being more memorable than success. Because success would have made Mirabel ordinary. Failure made it unforgettable.